Up. Hi, everybody. I'm Nancy Kaufman. I'm the chair of the board of the New York Jewish Agenda. And I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the New York Jewish Agenda, which is a fairly new organization that is trying to represent the pluralistic, diverse Jewish community of New York on issues related to policy on the domestic level and in regards to Israel. We're a liberal democratic group that believes that the voices of the majority of New Yorkers aren't always being heard in at City Hall, in the state, or in Israel. So that's who we are. I'm the chair of the board. Matt Nostenchuk is the president of the New York Jewish Agenda. And I want to welcome you all to a series of conversations that we have been sponsoring on a variety of issues. I want to thank our co-sponsors, Trua, who you will hear from in a bit, from the president and CEO, Jill Jacobs, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, a Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, the Marlene Meyerson JCC in Manhattan, and Yafet. And this is an important and very timely program for us to be taking on. We take seriously at NYJA our commitment to a very Jewish value of education for all people, and it's something that we as Jews have always advocated for equal and substantive secular and religious education, and we think that all children are entitled to have the opportunity to be able to learn and grow as Americans and as Jews, whether it's in private school or in public school. So today is one such issue. We're going to look at the issue of secular education in private schools in New York. And it's a topic that has generated a lot of discussion and some disagreement within the broader Jewish community. And we're going to explore that and go deeper into it. And I'm not going to belabor because I'm going to hand it over to Jill, who's going to moderate our panel and introduce our panelists. So Rabbi Jill Jacobs, wonderful to be with you. Thank you, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I am Rabbi Jill Jacobs. I'm the CEO of Trua, which is an organization that mobilizes more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors across the US and Canada on human rights issues. We work both here at home and also on domestic issues, and also in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And we're really glad to be here and to be having this conversation. Let me just say a couple of technical things before we introduce our panelists. So Q&A, you can see that there's a little Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen. Probably most of you are familiar with that by now. Please put in your questions as they come up in your head, and I will bring them into our discussion as we have time and when it seems like maybe they follow up on a previous question or conversation we've had. I really apologize in advance if I don't get to all the Q&A, but I will certainly try my best. And if you have any technical issues or anything like that, you can put that in the chat. And I don't know if I can help you, but somebody hopefully will be able to help you. Okay, so I'm really glad to introduce our panelists. We have, first of all, Rabbi Yisachar Katz, the chair of the Talmud department at Yeshivat Chovei Torah, who is also a graduate of a Satmar Yeshiva. We have Professor Shira Eve Epstein, who is an associate professor at the School of Education at City College and the director for the Social Studies Education Program, and Naftali Master, who's Yafet's executive director and also a graduate of a Hasidic yeshiva. So I'd like first to start with each of you telling us a little bit about why you personally care about the issue of education in yeshivot, what your personal connection is, why you're here with us today. We'll let whoever wants to go first can just jump in.
All right, I'm happy to start off as the executive director of Yafet. So, sorry. So I grew up in the Hasidic community. I was part of the Belz Hasidic sect. I happen to be the middle child of 17 kids. I'm just pointing that out to show my bona fides. And I attended Hasidic yeshivas my entire life, basically since I was 2.5 years old till I was 20. And at that point, I had a desire to become a psychologist and to pursue a degree in psychology, but I knew almost nothing about what that entails, actually. So, as I began looking into the process, I discovered how, woefully unprepared I was for that. I mean, obviously I didn't have a high school diploma, nor was I prepared to sort of get a GED or a high school equivalency without a tremendous amount of work. And then once I did manage to get into college, I was struggling immensely. And one day it occurred to me that there's a difference between my education and the ones of my peers. And I began looking into the laws pertaining to non-public schools, and I was shocked. I was blown away to learn that all non-public schools, including religious schools, must provide us an education that is, quote, at least substantially equivalent to public schools. And the guidelines of the state listed all the subjects that must be taught. And I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, we either didn't get any of that or we got a fraction of it, because in elementary and middle school, we got about 90 minutes of secular education a day. And it happened like an after-school program at the end of the school day. And then in high school, we got zero secular education, none whatsoever. And it was clear to me that this is in violation of the law. And that's when I began sort of, speaking to, first I spoke to Haredi leaders, and then to other yeshiva graduates and parents, and then eventually started speaking to government officials at the state level and the city level. And that's sort of what brings me here.
I'm happy to go last.
Shira, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Thank you so much for hosting this and for including me. So I'll share my answer just talking a little bit about my professional career. I came into the world of education as a middle school teacher, a middle school humanities teacher. And so when you ask why I care about the issue, I'll just say as a classroom teacher, day in and day out, I had the opportunity to see the potential of education being a change-making influence in the life of our state and our city's youth. So I believe in the power of an education and the power of a range of exposure to content areas and skill development. And in more recent years, I now work at the university level where I engage in teacher preparation. So I'm working with predominantly pre-service teachers, with some in-service teachers who are working to get certified and improve their craft. And in that role, I care about this question of the regulations because I believe in the power of teacher learning and the potential of teachers and institutions to learn and grow and take on new demands and competing interests and engage in them in a thoughtful way. I get to work with those growing and changing educators every day, and I'm inspired by them every day. And then finally, I do my research in a specific area of humanities education that focuses on civic education. And I care about this conversation concerning civic education because I know that the youth that are in our schools will grow up to be voters. And there's a very big and deep question that our country's schools are currently asking about how students' capacities and readiness to engage in civic life is being promoted, and the role that schools specifically can play. I know that democracy necessitates broad and meaningful engagement. And in order to promote those engagements, I do believe that schools are critical places to develop student civic readiness.
Okay, I'm happy to go last. Similar to Naftali, I grew up in the Haredi community, not in Belz, Chas v'Shalom, grew up in Satmar. For the insiders among us, that is a big difference, although they look the same and more or less do the same things. But I grew up in the Satmar community, and in terms of the Jewish education, I got a stellar education, which I'm really very, very thankful for. I no longer am in the community. I'm now outside of the community, and it so happens that the kind of work I pursued outside of the community was particular in the sense that my Jewish education came into use, came into practice. So I was not put at a disadvantage. But I'm a minority. Most of the people who want to go to work find themselves at a tremendous disadvantage. And for me, it's a question of, will my cousins, my nephews, my nieces have the opportunities to succeed in this world. And frankly, for me, it's important to make it clear that there isn't a connection between a solid secular education and secularism. I think that's kind of the biggest obstacle that a lot of people put up, is that, oh, secular education means becoming secular, being exposed to secularism. And my passion and my dedication is to make sure that that's not the case. One can have a solid secular education and still remain as devout and as pious as possible.
Great. So my next question is for either Naftali or Yisachar. You can decide who jumps in first and who adds. But both of you have personal experience attending yeshivot and also being in communities of people who have attended a range of yeshivot. And I'd love for you to each talk a little bit about the current situation in this yeshivot in terms of secular education, like what's it actually like, and also how we got to the current point where we are now in this battle for education in Haredi yeshivot. So how did we get to this political moment that we're in now? So either of you can jump in and then the other one can add whatever you want to add.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. So it's interesting. I mean, it's a little bit complicated because the question is, what are we discussing? Are we discussing this very moment? Are we discussing the original reality? And I think that, while we beat ourselves up about our failures and how we are not succeeding to get the yeshivot to adopt the government regulations, Yafet already had an impact. Yafet is having a tremendous impact. Over the years since Yafet came on the scene, a lot has changed and people are trying to respond. The question is whether that's sufficient and whether that's enough. And I would argue that it's a very good start, but a lot more needs to be done. And again, I think that part of the reason of why there are so many, they're taking baby steps is because that incredible fear and almost paralysis about what will it do to our children if we expose them to a secular education. And when the government is involved, that exacerbates the situation. And somehow there's a mistrust of the government because of a history that goes back to, governments back in Europe. But America is America. America is a malchut shel chesed. The American government has zero interest in changing Haredi kids. They couldn't care less, frankly. They have much bigger problems. All they want to do is to make sure that kids have a equal opportunity to succeed and grow in the world and support themselves comfortably and with dignity. I think that's really what it's about. It's about dignity. So that's a challenge. The challenge is to really try to convince the people that this is nothing more than about education and nothing else. And the government is not their enemy. The government is not here to do anything other than making sure that people have the opportunities. And quite frankly, the government is a help because the government can provide the resources, the government can provide the personnel. So that's really the obstacle here, is to kind of make people realize the baby steps are laudable, the baby steps are admirable, but why not take Johnny steps? Why not take real big steps to move on? Just don't drag it out so long.
Great. I'll just go a few steps back and talk about what are we saying is currently happening in the Hasidic yeshivas. So in most Hasidic yeshivas, the kids receive the kind of education that I received, and I suspect the Rabbi Katz received as well at the moment, which is the yeshiva day is mostly Judaic studies, if not entirely Judaic studies. So let's say take an 8-year-old kid, okay? They come to yeshiva at 9 a.m. and until 3:30 p.m., they study exclusively Judaic studies. And it doesn't include any secular content. I have to stress this because for people who are familiar with the, let's say, modern Orthodox system or non-Haredi system, they assume that even the Judaic studies contain some mixture of secular studies. Maybe it's taught in English or something, or maybe you learn a little bit about this character, that figure. No, it's just Judaic studies, the Torah, the Talmud, and halacha. And all of it is taught in Yiddish. The text is Hebrew or ancient Aramaic, but all of it is taught in Yiddish. And this goes till 3:30 p.m. Then at 3:30 p.m., they switch over. So it's like an after-school program, a new principal and new teachers, sometimes less Haredi than the Judaic studies teachers. And then for a maximum of 90 minutes, they receive secular education. And the way secular education is taught is very different than the Judaic studies. During Judaic studies, there's no monkey business. There's no trouble. The disciplining is much more serious. Come secular studies, it's a bit of a joke. Oftentimes, former yeshiva graduates call it, 90 minutes of recess. And I can go on about actual stories of what we did to our poor teachers during the secular studies portion. It was really terrible. I think that part has improved a lot, I should say. They do take the 90 minutes a little bit more seriously, but they still only teach basic English and arithmetic, and it's still only 90 minutes. And as I'm sure almost everyone on this call, on this meeting knows, on Friday, since we would finish early because of Shabbos, there is no secular study. So we're talking about 4 days a week, so a total of 6 hours max. But then in high school—
Natalie, can I just jump in? There was specifically a question in the chat about math, and you mentioned arithmetic. Can you just give us a sense of like somebody who's, let's say, getting to age 18 in this yeshiva, what would they be expected to know math-wise or English-wise? Like what would be, I know that all the yeshivot are, they're not all the same, but
Right.
Can you just give us a sense?
Sure. If you don't mind, before I get there, I just want to explain what it looks like in high school, because that will factor in a lot. Once Hasidic boys enter high school, which is right after they turn bar mitzvah, their education turns almost exclusively Judaic. No, not almost, exclusively Judaic. So from then on, they begin their school day from as early as 6:30 or 7 a.m. and they can go easily till 8:30 or 9 p.m. So we're talking about a good 14 hours a day in yeshiva, and they study exclusively Judaic studies. At that point, even the little secular education that existed is out the window, doesn't exist anymore. So you have these kids, closed off in a yeshiva, surrounded only by other kids of the same sect, the same Hasidic sect. Rabbis, the teachers are all males from the same sect. And this is why I'm bringing this up in response to that question, because even though the yeshivas do try to teach basic English and arithmetic, I would say up to fractions, they never go into algebra or anything like that. But even though they try to do so in elementary and middle school during those 90 minutes at the end of the day, when you cut off the kids from it at these crucial adolescent years before they actually go into the workforce or go and get married and so forth, then they don't retain any of that, right? So as adults, when you're asking me, what are they expected to know? I don't know if the answer is anything. You come out barely speaking English and certainly knowing almost no math whatsoever.
Thanks. And Natalia, while we have you talking, can you just talk us through the specific order of events in terms of the proposed regulations, what happened with those, where we are now politically?
Yes, of course. So basically, we started working on this issue in 2011 in a very informal manner, right? Spoke to some Haredi leaders and then started speaking to some government officials. It was sort of like an enigma. I don't know if that's the right word, but like a mystery. How is this happening, right? If we're understanding the law correctly, how is it happening so blatantly that they're not complying? So it was a slow process, and the state sent us to the city, and the city sent us to the state. They were playing, ball with this. Finally, in 2015, we filed a formal complaint. It was organized. It was organized by Yafed, but it was signed by 52 yeshiva graduates and parents who had kids in the yeshiva, alleging that at least 39 yeshivas in New York City alone were not meeting this minimum standard. So New York City launched an investigation, but it became clear very early on that the investigation is a bit of a sham, that it's not moving or it's not moving fast enough. So at some point, New York State looked at the existing law and guidelines and they said, you know what, it doesn't look like it's clear enough. Let's clarify it so that both the schools know what's expected of them, as well as the school districts that are supposed to enforce the law know what's expected of them. So they revised the guidelines and they released it in 2018, November of 2018. The problem was the yeshivas were joined by independent schools and the Catholic schools in opposing those guidelines. They didn't want any additional oversight, but the excuses they used were a little bit different. The court actually struck down those guidelines and said the state needs to re-release them as regulations. So the state did that in 2019. And then all these schools once again opposed the regulations. The yeshivas, we know why they opposed it. They said, we want to be able to do whatever we want. You have no say in the matter. That's why they're opposing it. The Catholics opposed it for a more reasonable reason. They said they don't want the local school districts to be the ones to come in and review their schools, because they said in some districts, maybe not New York City, but in some districts, they're competing for the same students, right? Because public school kids could go to Catholic schools and vice versa. So they opposed it for that reason. And then the independent schools opposed it because they said, we already go through a rigorous accreditation process. So why do we need to go through another process by the local school district sanctioned by the state? So they opposed it for that reason. All in all, the state basically decided to get rid of those proposed regulations. And then we got hit by COVID. So there was a big pause. And then finally, they re-released new regulations in March, and we're in the 60-day public comment period, which is going to end on May 31st. And these regulations differ from the previous one. The previous ones were a lot more prescriptive about the exact number of hours that must be spent on each subject. And the purpose was not to be too prescriptive. The purpose was actually by the state, it was to be objective. They wanted to make sure that schools don't complain that a local school district is persecuting them or is picking on them, right? So they tried to make it as objective as possible with a checklist and all of that. But since it was struck down, they came back and these new regulations, they have multiple pathways which satisfy the Catholic schools, they satisfy the independent schools, they satisfy schools that are already complying with the law. So now what you have left is these core group of yeshivas that don't comply with the law, and they're up in arms because they know that if these regulations are enforced, there's a chance that they'll actually have to up their standards and comply.
Thanks so much. So Shira, you are an expert in education, and as you mentioned, your specialty is in civic education. And you also mentioned that, I mean, schools balance all sorts of competing interests, whether it's that they're Catholic schools or community Jewish schools or art schools or whatever their different interests are. And so I'm wondering if you can talk to us about how schools in general balance competing interests and what this might say about the possibilities for yeshiva education.
Sure, thank you. Well, I first, building on what you said, want to offer just a little bit of narrative around what these competing interests could look like. So the ones that I believe the new proposed regulations for substantial equivalency focus on, and the type of competing interests that I think even a kindergartner would be able to speak to has to do with like competing interests of subject area. So this idea that a school leader or a classroom teacher has a range of content areas that they need to address. That's one kind of pressure that teachers and school leaders feel, and we could go down the whole list: math, language, arts, physical education, science education, civics, art, and the list goes on. And the dialogue among all state schools about what's the balance that's happening in schools and is the balance what will best serve kids is a robust dialogue. As somebody who's involved in civics, we look a lot at social studies education, and social studies education is having a tough fight right now, getting a good presence, especially at the elementary school level, where reading and math gets a lot more focus as the more testable content areas. So that's competing interest number one, has to do with like subject area. But I also just wanted to bring attention that there are also competing interests that can be harder to sniff out, but are still important to recognize, that have to do more with like competing approaches to education. So for example, to what extent do we create opportunities for a student-centered curriculum, a curriculum where students are pursuing their own interests and learning through experimentation and play, as opposed to a more teacher-directed teacher-directed approach. In the first approach, students are given electives and a lot of choice and can pursue their own research projects, whereas in the second approach, there will be a stricter pacing calendar introducing students to required facts and topics and disciplinary ideas. So now, Jill, to your question about how teachers deal with these competing interests, I'll bring attention, I think, to three key areas. So area number one is what I'll just broadly characterize as like professional reflection and study. So when a new expectation comes down the pike and teachers are expected to embrace and consider some new priority, or even if it's not a new priority, maybe a priority that was previously marginalized or people are arguing did not get enough attention, teachers come together in professional community, either school-based or organized by other institutions like universities, and consider, what is this new approach? What will this approach bring to youth? Another, more managerial way that schools deal with competing interests is by just getting a firm grip on the schedule. So this is, where teachers talk about administrators having like a masterful sense of like, how many hours do we have? What is it that we are prioritizing, and figuring out those time blocks. Now, again, I fear entering that managerial level without doing that professional reflection and study, because the norms that the teaching community and professional community concludes is going to end up informing that schedule. And the third response that I'll offer up is that schools deal with competing interests by looking for ways that multiple interests are not always competing. And they're looking for ways that something that they already do actually supports this additional thing. And I say that, with some caution, that there are definitely educational leaders that fear that, if we do too much, like, oh yeah, that's already happening in that other subject area and we can sort of mush it all together, people argue, well, then actually in some ways, neither one is happening in a really rich and robust way. But still, my experience in schools tells me that if it's grounded in professional development, reflection and learning, there are ways that teachers can creatively find points of like mutual support, and not always see interests as directly competing.
Thanks so much. Yishachar, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what the main arguments are by Haredi leaders against the regulations. Specifically, we've heard that there's some Haredi yeshiva leaders who claim that the Judaic studies curriculum already contains most of the requirements. So I'm curious how you respond to that assessment, and whether that rings true to you or not, whether the Haredi community should be left on its own to manage the schools.
Right. Wow, that's a lot of questions.
You can respond or reformulate.
How much time do you have? Let me pick the middle one for a second, because that's been something that's been going on, that's been going around for a long time. And for a long time, I was an absolutist, but I've come to appreciate that there's a little bit more nuance. So the big argument is, they have much of what's needed in the Gemara. They learn about math, they learn about languages, they learn about other topics, science, and so on and so forth, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yes and no. Does learning Gemara make you, if you're a good student, I'm saying just the top notch, let's talk about the elite students, right? The 10% of students who do well in Haredi yeshivas. Does that make them sophisticated thinkers? I would argue that it does, I mean, you live in this environment where you're constantly critically thinking and responding and asking questions, in Yiddish, there's a word I used to say was that the most important word for a yeshiva bacher is efsher verkehrt. Maybe the opposite, right? It's just like, even if you haven't thought for a minute, but first try, maybe can I make the counter argument? So in that sense, in that kind of attitude of critical thinking, questioning, challenging authority, I do think that a Hasidic education helps. When it comes to the specifics, I feel so bad doing this. This is my family. This is not people who are strangers. This is my siblings, my brothers, my sisters, who I love dearly. It's a little ludicrous argument. It's a ridiculous argument. I've taught Daf Yomi for 9 years. I've gone through all of the Talmud, teaching it for a public of about 100 people every day. None of the math, none of the science, none of the physics, none of the history, none of the linguistics have anything to do whatsoever with the kind of linguistics, the kind of physics, the kind of science that you need in order to succeed in the world. Is there some kind of, continuum link? Yeah, one can. If you do the history of science, you can say, oh, look, rabbinic medicine is based on Galen, so you should know, okay, that's where they based our medicine. Oh, but we have now moved away from that, right? Or did the rabbis know about pi? Yeah, they knew about pi, so you know about pi where you learn Talmud, right? And people point to that always as, look, there's math. That's the only thing, and even that, I would say in the percentage of how much they spend time on the actual mathematics of pi, it's minuscule. So the answer is, unfortunately, no. You have none of what you learn in the Gemara, what you learn in the Chassidish curriculum, prepares you for the actual nitty-gritty of what it means to study science. That's number one. Number two, and that's the most tragic, I think, the inability to conjugate a sentence in English, the inability to write a paper, the inability to express an idea. None of that. I remember when I left the Haredi community, right? I left the Haredi community a long time ago. I would say about something about 25 years ago. I couldn't put two sentences together. And I went to this teacher's program that was affiliated with Drisha, and it was demeaning and humiliating. I didn't know how to express an idea. So the short and long answer is, do you get something from learning Talmud? Yes, it makes you smart. Again, the percentage that is, engaged and involved. Does it help you in the nitty gritty of what it means to succeed in the world? It hurts me to say that the answer is 0.
Thanks. I will say, from my memory, the rabbis never got past pi being 3, but I will say that in all of my education in public schools of being told that, like, oh, here's the formula, nobody ever told me that pi was a ratio. So I did actually learn that from the Gemara.
Right. Well.
You can use that as a, I don't know, as a condemnation of how math used to be taught.
This is insider baseball from one rabbi to another rabbi. Right? The line in the Gemara is lo dak, right? So it's 3+. So it's actually a little bit more precise. It's 3 and something, So okay, but that's all there is. Exactly, right.
Okay, but beyond that,
if I may just.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I just wanted to follow up because I feel like there's a lot of confusion here. I get emails all the time, or sometimes Yafed, gets emails in response to eBlast if, we happen to have a few people subscribed who are not exactly fans. There'll be something, they'll say, oh, you want to teach, transgender. That's what you really want to teach to our students, right? That's always the immediate response. That's what we're trying to do. And many people cannot comprehend that what we're talking about is basic English, arithmetic, science, and social studies that is currently absent from the yeshivas. And I think this is often even with people who know about Jewish schools, like, but they assume that it's sort of like Ramaz, it's like SAR, where hey, they can incorporate some secular studies in the Judaic studies content. And I think this is an important thing to point out because yes, you can teach, let's say, math, and you could say, oh, so for instance, a sukkah has to be this high and this wide and so on and so forth. What the people who argue that this already exists in the Talmud, which Yisachar mentioned, they're trying to say that just because the Talmud teaches you the dimensions of a sukkah, which happens to be in a non-current measurement form even, that constitutes math. In other words, it's being taught in passing when you're learning Talmud, not the other way around. It's not like you have a course on math and it's just the teacher uses a sukkah as an example, or you're learning about science and they use a certain kosher animal versus non-kosher animal. They're literally trying to argue that by virtue of learning what is a kosher animal and what is not, that's part of a scientific course. And I think that's something that I don't think the public grasps how little and non-existent the secular studies exist, both in the secular portion of the day, which is again almost non-existent, let alone in the Judaic studies portion of the day.
Great, thank you so much. Sure. I'm wondering if you can talk to us about what some of the markers are of a strong education in humanities and in civics, and why is it important that students receive a strong civic education? And maybe also if you can talk in that about, since you work in teacher preparation, how do you define a competent teacher? So what processes does one use to assess teacher competency, and either for state certification specifically or in general?
Okay. First of all, in terms of markers of what we're looking for in the humanities, and then there's a derivative version of it in civics. I'd say pretty standard thinking in education is that there are going to be these major bins that you need to talk to. So bin number one, I'll call attention to content. So what that means is like ensuring that students have some foundational knowledge that enables students to build additional knowledge off of that base. Okay, so for example, if we want students to be able to engage and build knowledge about the war in Ukraine, they need to have knowledge of where Ukraine exists on a map. They should know something about NATO. They should ideally have some core knowledge about like the history of imperialism. So that's an example of what it means to build like content knowledge. Bin number two is attention to what we'll call skill. And that's what Naftali and Yeshivot have been talking about in terms of writing skills, verbal skills. So the Common Core was a key influence in our recent influence in our education circles to help us define what are those skills. And they define a series of reading skills, writing skills, and also speaking and listening skills that focus on things like when you're reading, finding the main idea, when you're writing, articulating a clear argument, being able to write in different genres, such as argument, narrative writing, explanatory writing. And the list goes on. When you're reading, being able to identify point of view, and they're all enumerated. So teachers are asked to understand that while they're building the content knowledge, what skill development are students engaging in? So attention to content, attention to skill, and then the third one, I'm going to lump a few together for sake of time, is what I'll just call like attention to the student and society. So those are the points where we need to be attentive to the students' interests, what students are experiencing in the rest of their day and in the rest of their world. And again, what my co-panelists have been speaking to in their recent responses, I think touches on this directly. So if we're teaching a math lesson, I teach a book with my students that talk about the value that when students are doing math problems related to perimeter and area, the teacher is asking them to bring in pictures of the elevators that are in their apartment building so that they're seeing something that's familiar to them. They feel at home in the content, but the rest of the rest of the lesson is about how we think about those elevators in mathematical ways and develop mathematical skill in reference to them. So Naftali, your past example about the sukkah is a great example of that. So we think about the students who are in front of us. We think about what is relevant and culturally relevant and meaningful to them. We also think about their level of readiness. What are they ready for? What's going to make them hit an area of academic frustration, either content-wise or skill-wise, and we address that. So I would say a strong education is attentive to skill building, knowledge building, and also attention to the student and their society and how we welcome them into the classroom. Should I pause, or the answer about civics directly extends from that. So the New York State Board of Regents very recently has a civic education initiative. They define civic readiness using similar language. So students need to have some civic knowledge, that is knowledge of government, law, history, current events. They need to have some civic skills. Yeshivot, you spoke about the skill of critical thinking that you believe is already at work. Also, a civic skill is verbal expression, ability to create an argument. The civic world is also talking a lot, understandably right now, about media literacy, how to be able to read things and assess their trustworthiness. So this all comes into the bin of civic skills. And then the New York Board of Regents also defines something called civic mindsets. So this is like a commitment to fairness, a commitment to diversity, empathy, to democratic participation. And then the fourth bin is this thing that they call civic experiences, which is creating real-time opportunities for students to engage in local issues that are important to them, and give them opportunity to exercise those knowledge, skills, and mindsets.
Thanks so much. There's a bunch of questions that have come in about why should the broader Jewish community care, first of all? And if we care, then what should we actually be doing to support secular education? So I'll throw that to any of you who want to pick that question up.
Take it, Naftali.
Oh, I mean, I think it's a human rights issue. It's a human rights violation. I think everyone should care. I saw there's a whole debate about whether this panel is fair, given that you don't have a yeshiva leader literally arguing the other side. I don't see this expectation existing really, especially when we're talking about a core human right where it's documented that kids are being denied an education. And I think this affects, so it's a human rights issue and it affects all of New Yorkers, including because these yeshivas are funded by taxpayers, as are the graduates of these yeshivas who disproportionately are forced to rely on government assistance because of the way their leaders, harm them for their entire lives. Specifically for the Jewish community, I think it matters because whether we like it or not, this is going to be the future face of the Jewish people, I think. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a new report that by 2040, 1 in 4 Jewish people will be ultra-Orthodox. In New York City, that's already the case. And we had a study in 2017 that by 2030, 30% of all of Brooklyn's youth will be Hasidic. So the point is, this is something that affects all of New Yorkers, but specifically the broader Jewish community. So I do think that they should be more worried about this. And they talk a lot about social justice issues. This is one that is in our backyard, like literally just a few miles from, the headquarters of the NYJA Federation, right? NYJA and other groups often send, money and resources to even in Israel to address the same issues that we have right here. But here, there's a fear of sort of antagonizing the Haredi leaders, but we can't think that way. We have to get involved. We have to get our hands dirty and even get into controversy. So what could be done? I think at a minimum, the public, and the Jewish, mainstream should support these regulation and in general support oversight. It would be nice if there's a real conversation about what the broader Jewish community is doing to address this major social justice issue. And if they would sort of charter buses for other causes, whether it's to DC or Albany or whatever, then we should see the same thing here. And, whatever else can be done to address this issue.
If I can piggyback on what Naftali said, so I'll kvetch a little bit about my own adoptive community, if I may, the modern Orthodox community. And so I find it extremely frustrating. To be fair, I think that Aguda and the right-wing modern Orthodox community have raised questions about, well, where will it end? And if the government tells us one day to do this, will they tell us another day to do something else? Which I think needs to be addressed. I mean, it's similar to the whole Alito question, going on about Roe v. Wade. Will Alito stop at abortion, or is there a continuum? So there are always these concerns of is it limited and concretized. So I hear that concern, and that's fair. But then you see people in the modern Orthodox community coming out in defense of the Hasidische curriculum and the Hasidische yeshivas. And I find it so bothersome because, I don't want to kind of get sidetracked, but it reminds me of a LGBTQ analogy. I know we talked about how we want to bring LGBTQ into the Haredi community, but that's not it. But, in the Haredi community, at least for until recently, there used to be this idea of people would say, even if you identify as gay, you should still marry, someone of the other sex. And I always remember when I would hear that, I would say, well, would you let your daughter marry someone who's gay? And I'm sure the answer would be, no, I didn't mean my daughter. I mean, they should marry someone, right? But that someone is also someone's daughter. So if you're advising it, and if it's not, you wouldn't do it, why would you advise it for someone else? And I feel similarly about my own community. Some of the leadership in the minoritized community came out in defense of the Haredi curriculum. And I'm thinking, would you send your kids to Hasidic yeshiva? And of course the answer is no, right? They would send their kids to schools that give them a rock solid education. And I have to say there's almost something condescending and patronizing by the defending the Hasidic yeshivas as if this is going to be like this kind of, museum piece. We have to preserve a small group of people that they are going to be, doing Judaism of Taharas HaKodesh. Will you pay the price? Will your cousins grow up in poverty? Will your cousins have to kind of, resort to some kind of, other means to kind of survive that we would rather not? So it's extremely frustrating when you see people outside of the community defending that. But when the question is, would you send your child? We all know that the answer is absolutely unequivocally not. So this is really painful. And I've seen it this morning on Facebook with a prominent modern Orthodox rabbi. Recently, there was a whole video with one of the leaders in modern Orthodoxy, and I was tempted to pick up the phone and say to them, oh, so does your son go to Satmar? I don't remember that. And it's really frustrating when people don't think through that which they're advocating.
Thank you so much. So there's a question that came in from someone who wants to be clear that he's a proud supporter of YAFED, who asks about the costs of a dual curriculum. So I'm just going to kind of paraphrase the question, but when you look at like the Heschels and Ramazes and Schechters and SARs of the world, like those schools are really expensive, comparable to the Daltons and everything else. Whereas Hasidic schools, which primarily serve a low-income population, really, perhaps for some of the reasons that Yitzhak Zachar was just saying, are some of the least expensive day schools. They're not comparable in price to any of the schools I mentioned. And the question is whether, that just secular instruction could increase the cost of education. You need teachers who are competent to do that, and et cetera. And would that require tuition increases? It would be hard to handle under the current revenue models. And if so, how do we address that?
I'm curious to hear what Shira has to say on this. I have some thoughts, but Shira, what do you think?
Okay. So reasons why the fear it has to do with like concern about the cost of those teachers that would be ready to teach in all of those content areas.
Well, I think the question is, would the schools not be able to manage their current economic model, which is a very low cost tuition, if they had to teach secular studies, and if the prices went up, probably the community couldn't afford them. So is there a different economic, is that necessarily true? Is there a different economic model that could work?
So someone just chimed in. If you think that education is expensive, wait till you see ignorance. Yeah, I have to say I don't feel like I can speak strongly about the budgeting decisions behind it, I think that it's an interesting question about like what the model of teacher hiring would become. And because I know I spoke at the very beginning about the potential of teachers as learners. That's what I witness every day. So to what extent can some of these norms be served by professional development? But yes, to Naftali's point that he raised at the beginning, when you get into the secondary grades, especially there where that importance of having somebody, Jill, this comes back to your question about what's a competent teacher, that having somebody who has strong subject area knowledge, in addition to strong knowledge of pedagogy, yes, that does involve, who you're hiring and who you're bringing into your staff. And I think that this question of like, how are we going to get these people on board and how are we going to get them on their roster is one that I I think is an important challenge for the schools to take on because of the human rights concerns that have been articulated. How do we get these people onto our rosters? Does it imagine some new way of thinking about school funding and granting? And I think all of those are very healthy and good questions, but I don't really, I don't advocate that the economic concern is held up as like, you know, the reason why, like, no, we just can't go down that path. That's what I'll offer up.
I'll add another question to this, and that's from my vantage point as the snobby, learner. I grew up in the Haredi community, and I said I got a solid Jewish education. And I think part of the reason why I got a solid Jewish education is because it was a full day. It was a full immersion, right? And I have to say that oftentimes I'll wonder about my adoptive community, my Orthodox community, where a 90, if not 100% of the kids have dual curriculums. They only learn half the amount of time. So it seems to be coming at a cost of, the breadth and depth. And that's a big question. That's a good question. I think we're going to make a mistake if we ignore it, make a mistake if we deny it. At the end of the day, I tell my students, it's a long story, but the short version of that is that one of the Brisker rabbis had a son who was mentally not well. And one of the things about him is that he also had these kind of, outbreaks of anxiety where he would let loose a litany of curses. And he kind of kept the worst curse till the end. And what was the worst thing that he said after saying all the terrible things, blah, 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 I'm haaretz, right? That was the worst thing you can say about someone. You're an ignoramus. So this is a community that cherishes Torah and cherishes knowledge, cherishes learning. So the question is, if you introduce a dual curriculum, will that come at the expense of raising Talmidei Chachamim? But I have to say that's a question that I struggle with in my own job teaching at a modern Orthodox rabbinical school, which I'm not going to get into. We have technologies that expedites our education. We have a lot of programs and technological means that can compensate for time. So would a dual curriculum be as comprehensive as a full day curriculum? Maybe not, but it would not be a half and half. There are a lot of means we have today, technology, that make it easier. I mean, I tell people always, you can't see me, but I'm lifting my laptop. In my laptop, I carry a database of 157,000 Sfarim, right? Because our databases, Otzar Chachma, for example, that 157,000 Sfarim. Imagine how much time I saved myself. Otherwise, I would have traveled to a library, got on the train and all that. Now I don't have to do that. I just click on, and there I have all the Sfarim that I need. I put in, some kind of a combination of a code word, and 7,000 sources come up. So I think there are means today to compensate for what gets lost by the less time we have to do Judaic studies.
I'm also wondering, I don't know if you would agree with this, but there are kids who are going to go on to be, who are going to go on to be very learned, who are going to go on to be rabbis. There are kids who are just, that's not where their head is, right? They're not going to be Talmud scholars. And, I do wonder whether there's a basic, everybody needs the same basic education, like then some kids are just going to sit in yeshiva for the rest of their lives. And like, maybe not everybody needs to be expected to get up to that standard.
Amen va'amen. I feel that the best thing that could happen for the Hasidic community is to identify kids at a certain age. I don't know. I'm sure Shira is more qualified to kind of identify what age and say, you know what? This person seems to gravitate towards Talmud. They'll do the advanced Talmud curriculum. And then this kid just doesn't take to it, which is a problem in the Hasidic community anyway. And can you imagine how much happier kids would be when there would be more than one option? I couldn't agree with you more, Rabbi Jacobs. Absolutely.
So we only have a couple more minutes. So Shira and then Naftali, if you have any last comment, and then I'm going to turn to Matt Nosenchuk, who just popped up to close us out.
Naftali, I know that you didn't get to directly address the funding question, but I thought of an additional thing that I wanted to chime in with. Did you want to say anything on that regard?
No, it's okay. I can go after. Don't worry about it.
So the one additional perspective that I wanted to bring to it that I realized I should add on is that this question of how do schools afford to do all that they want to do, and how do they afford to bring students the high quality education that we all know they deserve, is a very large perennial educational question that people are asking for all schools. And I would say framing it that way, framing it as this like broad civic question, where people are empowered to come to the table and say, we are committed to giving our students this excellent education, and we are defining this excellent education in a way that is aligned with the substantial equivalency guidelines. And we've done a thorough analysis of like our budget and our needs, and here's where we're coming up short, and then engaging in the civic advocacy that's necessary to help bridge that funding gap. Those are civic campaigns that school systems and teachers are involved in. So the idea of including our Jewish educators that are a part of the yeshivot in that dialogue is to me that would be an actual step to think about the funding concerns.
I will say, I'm not going to talk. We don't have time to talk about budgeting the time of allocation for Judaic and secular studies. I think Rabbi Yisaska Katz did a good job, discussing some of these concerns. But in terms of the financial considerations, I will say, look, Hasidic girls' schools do kind of exactly what we want the Hasidic boys' schools to do. My very sisters who went to a Belz Hasidic yeshiva, I went to a Belz boys' school, they went to a Belz girls' school. They split their day in half. Half was Jewish, half was secular studies, and both were fine, right? So what I suggest is, we're not asking, the teachers to suddenly, have PhDs in whatever to teach math and science and social studies. There will be a transitional period. At the moment, they can use some of the same teachers. They already use Hasidic men to teach secular studies, the English and arithmetic. They can have those same people, just allocate more time to secular studies, take it more seriously, extend it through high school. But again, those same people who I would assume they're not underpaying, right? They can start teaching secular studies. More time, more subjects should be taught, and they should take it more seriously as opposed to the current kind of joke that it is considered. I think, I don't see that should change a lot the cost for these schools.
Thank you. I see there's some questions and comments that we didn't get to, so I apologize for that, but it's been a very rich conversation. Matt Nosenchuk just put in the chat box how to submit comments on the proposed regulations, which is the main thing that Yafet is asking people to do. And Naftali just put in a link, so you should follow that link. And I want us to close off by introducing Matt Nosenchuk, who's the CEO of NYJA, to send us on our way.
Thanks so much, Jill, and thank you, Socher and Shira and Naftali, for a really great and thoughtful discussion on an important topic. I know there were some comments in the chat and some on Twitter about, well, why didn't you invite others from the Hasidic community? I mean, the fact of the matter is this is a polarizing issue, and I have been told that folks from the community will not appear, and with this group of panelists. So I personally am someone who's very committed to robust dialogue, even when it includes disagreement, and certainly at NYJA, I'm interested in fostering that. So I want to thank everyone who attended today. I want to encourage people to submit their comments to the email address or website that we included. And you got a great sense from the panelists today and from Jill's deft moderation of the panel of the range of issues, some of the questions that are out there that seek to undermine the position that Yafet is fighting for. So this is an important issue that I hope that you all will engage on. So thanks very much for joining, and we'll see you at our next event. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.